Saul was not afraid of David. He was afraid of what David might reveal in him. And that kind of fear, the fear of the mirror, is the most devastating of all, because you cannot kill a mirror. The sound of a spear slicing through the air and violently striking the stone wall marks the breaking point of a dynasty. Just inches from David, the granite of the Gibeah palace bears the mark of a hatred that human logic cannot explain. Why would Saul, the man chosen to lead the Creator's people, attempt to murder the young man who had just silenced the nation's enemies? What the king saw in David was not merely a musician or a warrior, but a clear reflection of a spiritual approval that he himself no longer possessed. In this video, we will examine the anatomy of a devastating internal collapse. You will understand why David's success became Saul's torment, how envy consumes the spiritual survival of those who nurture it, and above all, the secret of resilience when your integrity becomes the target of unjust persecution. Often, the deepest pain does not come from a declared enemy, but from where we expected support. Perhaps you have already experienced the isolation that arises when your dedication to the Creator unintentionally exposes the lack of zeal in those around you. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 18, verses 7 and 8, we read that the women celebrated the victory by saying, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s." Those words were the spark. Saul did not hear praise for his general. He heard the announcement of his own decline. The sacred record says that Saul was very angry, and that psalm displeased him deeply. Have you ever felt that your spiritual success stirs resentment in someone who should be your mentor? When human approval becomes more important than the sovereign's approval, the human heart becomes fertile ground for persecution. Here, spiritual survival demands that we understand something vital. Saul's conflict was not against David, but against the divine purpose itself. A leader's fall is rarely a sudden event. It is the final result of a silent erosion in the structure of character. Saul did not become a persecutor overnight. The hatred that consumed him was the byproduct of a broken spiritual mechanism. While David acted with a prudence that conveyed tranquility, Saul was tormented by a void where the approval of the Most High once dwelled. This contrast was unbearable. When the biblical record mentions that a spirit of anguish seized the king, it describes the agony of one who realizes that external authority, the crown, the throne, and the army, means nothing when the internal connection with the sovereign has been severed. This detail changes everything. Saul did not fear David's sword. He feared the light that emanated from David. The young shepherd's success functioned as a relentless mirror, reflecting everything the king had lost through his own disobedience. Saul quickly understood that brute force would not be enough to silence the Creator's purpose in David's life. Therefore, he shifted his tactics from direct attacks to dark manipulation, using his own family and military service as instruments of death. He offered his daughter in marriage under a condition that seemed like a death sentence, the delivery of spoils from 100 enemies. The plan was sophisticated in its malice. Saul hoped that David's own courage would be his downfall. However, every political trap turned into a pedestal for the young shepherd's integrity. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 18, verse 12, the biblical record reveals what was truly happening behind the scenes of the king's mind. Saul was afraid of David because the Creator was with David, but had withdrawn from Saul. This contrast is the heart of our understanding of spiritual survival. While Saul accumulated power and soldiers, he was losing what truly matters, the sovereign's favor. The king's fear was not of David's army, but of the invisible presence that made him unshakable. Imagine the tense silence of the palace corridors, where a monarch trembles before the peace of a subject. Saul realized he was not fighting against a man, but against the decree of the Most High itself. For the servant of God, this detail changes everything. Your security does not lie in the absence of enemies, but in the certainty that no human plot can nullify what the loving Father has already sealed. Saul's relentless persecution placed David in a narrow corridor between instinctive self-defense and unwavering loyalty. It is easy to speak of trust in the Creator when times are peaceful, but true spiritual survival is forged in the heat of injustice, especially when that pressure comes from those who should protect us. David had multiple opportunities to end his suffering with a single strike, but he chose the path of submission to divine timing. He understood a profound truth that many neglect today. The flawed character of an authority does not negate the respect due to the arrangement that the Heavenly Father has allowed to exist. By refusing to raise his hand against the anointed, David was not demonstrating physical weakness, but monumental spiritual strength. He knew that by trying to bring justice with his own hands, he would be acting exactly like Saul, trusting in himself rather than trusting in the sovereign. Many of us, when facing undeserved opposition, are tempted to use the same weapons as our persecutors: sarcasm, retaliation, or silent vengeance. However, David's integrity teaches us that our role is not to forcefully correct the world, but to remain faithful under pressure. When you choose not to strike back, you are declaring that the Most High is your true judge and protector. This is the dilemma that defines your maturity. Do you trust the Heavenly Father enough to allow Him to write the final chapter of your story? Saul's blind persecution produced an isolation that no army or wall could breach. By trying to eliminate the one the Most High had chosen, the king sealed his own spiritual loneliness, turning the palace into a place of empty echoes and shadows of distrust. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 19, verse 10, the sacred record describes the decisive moment of the rupture. Saul tried to pin David to the wall with his spear, but David dodged, and the spear drove into the wall. That night, David fled and escaped. This impact marked the end of their coexistence and the beginning of a new phase of spiritual survival. While Saul lost the support of his own family and the clarity of his mind, the wilderness became the sanctuary where David's faith would be refined. This detail changes everything. What seemed like David's defeat, exile, and deprivation was actually the protection of the Heavenly Father, removing him from a corrosive and murderous influence. David's isolation in the caves of Adullam and the wilderness of Ziph was not divine abandonment, but a school of absolute dependence. Saul possessed the throne and the crown, but lived in constant terror. David possessed only the promise, but rested under the shadow of the Almighty. The lesson for us is profound. Often the loving Father allows us to be led into our own particular wilderness, so that we may learn that true security does not reside in human structures, but in the unshakable presence of the sovereign. Saul's persecution of David reveals a stark truth. The greatest battlefield for spiritual survival is not in the palace corridors or the cave shadows, but in the invisible territory of the heart. Envy is not merely a passing emotion. It is a pathology of the soul that occurs when we stop celebrating what the Creator has entrusted to us and instead lament what He has granted to another. When you find yourself at a disadvantage or under attack by someone consumed by resentment, your greatest defense is not the counterattack, but the guarding of your own spirit. Survival, in this context, does not mean keeping your reputation intact or winning a public dispute, but ensuring that the poison of another's bitterness does not contaminate your own worship. Saul's fatal error was transforming David's blessing into his own personal curse, allowing another's brightness to obscure his vision of the Most High's goodness. For the serious student of the Scriptures, the lesson is crystal clear. Spiritual peace depends on recognizing that the Heavenly Father distributes His gifts and assignments according to His sovereign wisdom. If today you are the target of undeserved persecution, understand that justice is not a burden you must carry with your own hands, but a promise the loving Father will fulfill at the exact time. Maintaining integrity while pressure demands retaliation is the ultimate proof that your faith is anchored in the sovereign, not in circumstances. The same God who sustained David in isolation is watching your faithfulness now. This event illustrates a profound spiritual law. When power is used to silence the Creator's purpose, it ultimately isolates the one who wields it from all peace. Saul remained in the palace, surrounded by luxury and armies, but plunged into a dread that no music or counsel could calm. In contrast, David was led into the wilderness, a place of physical deprivation, but spiritual abundance. In the caves and arid valleys, he discovered that the Most High is not merely a God of public victories, but a personal refuge in times of anguish. Spiritual survival does not depend on the absence of threats, but on the presence of the one who sustains us when the world rejects us. In isolation, David learned to depend exclusively on the Heavenly Father, transforming his persecution into a school of resilience and unshakable faith. David's true spiritual survival was not secured by his agility in dodging spears, but by his absolute refusal to allow Saul's poison to contaminate his own soul. There is a silent danger when we are wronged, the temptation to become the reflection of our persecutor. Saul looked at David and saw a rival who needed to be destroyed. David looked at Saul and saw an arrangement that needed to be respected out of fear of the sovereign. If today you face undeserved persecution or feel that your integrity has become a target, understand that the silence of the wilderness is where the Creator refines his most precious servants. Spiritual survival requires constant vigilance over the heart, so that bitterness does not turn into rebellion against the Most High. By choosing not to retaliate, you are not demonstrating weakness, but an unshakable confidence that justice belongs to the loving Father and will be executed in perfect time. The world may demand that you fight with Saul's same weapons, slander, envy, and hatred, but your security lies in remaining under the protection of truth. When you surrender your cause to the sovereign, the weight of injustice ceases to crush your shoulders and instead becomes the step that draws you closer to spiritual maturity. David's journey now takes us from the open plains into the dark interior of the caves of En-Gedi, where spiritual survival would face its most refined test. It was no longer about fleeing from a spear, but about resisting the temptation to resolve injustice with one's own hands. When Saul unknowingly entered the same cave where David was hiding, the silence of the place became deafening. David's men whispered what seemed like obvious logic. The Creator had finally delivered his enemy into their hands. However, spiritual survival operates on a different frequency than human convenience. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 24, verse 6, the record reveals the depth of David's integrity by stating, "It is unthinkable on my part, because of the Creator, that I would do such a thing to my Lord, the Anointed, by stretching out my hand against him." This moment defines the boundary between a human leader and a servant of the Most High. David understood that taking what the Heavenly Father had not yet formally delivered would be an act of rebellion, not liberation. By cutting only the edge of Saul's robe, his heart struck him, not out of fear of the king, but out of reverence for the sovereign's arrangement. True spiritual survival is the capacity to wait for the loving Father's timing, even when the easiest way out is within your reach. David chose to remain a faithful fugitive rather than become a rushed monarch, proving that his security lay in the Creator's justice, not on the edge of a blade. Many analyze Saul's fall only through the lens of emotional instability or a political dispute for the throne. But this view ignores the spiritual machinery that truly drove that conflict. The persecution of David was not a matter of national security. It was an open rebellion against the judgment of the Most High. When Saul tried to eliminate the chosen successor, he was, in practice, attempting to nullify the Creator's word. The common perspective fails by treating Saul as an ordinary man having a bad day, when in reality he represents the maximum risk to spiritual survival, the point where pride becomes so dense that the Heavenly Father's voice can no longer penetrate. David did not survive by luck or superior strategic skill. He survived because his will was perfectly aligned with divine sovereignty. While Saul struggled to maintain an image of authority, David cultivated the reality of submission. Here lies the essential technical contention. Success is not measured by who holds the throne, but by who maintains integrity. Saul's story proves that it is possible to have all the power in the world and still be spiritually dead, while David, even as a fugitive, possessed the abundant life that flows only from the sovereign's approval. The true danger is not the enemy who pursues us, but the ego that distances us from absolute dependence on the Creator. Saul's final trajectory ends as a dense shadow, while David's remains an unshakable beacon for all who today face undeserved opposition. This sacred narrative teaches us that the Creator does not measure spiritual survival by the throne someone occupies or the influence they wield, but by the purity and submission of the heart that beats within the chest. Saul wasted his final years trying to protect a kingdom that no longer belonged to him, consumed by a bitterness that completely isolated him from divine counsel. In contrast, David protected his relationship with the Heavenly Father above any claim to power, understanding that the sovereign's approval was his only true treasure. As we look at the outcome of these two men, we recognize a profound truth. We are not called to win every human dispute or to prove our innocence before those who hate us, but to be approved by the Most High in the midst of testing. Your spiritual integrity is the only possession that no spear can pierce and no political plot can steal. David's real victory was not the conquest of Israel's crown, but the fact that upon ascending the throne, he was still the same man who respected the Lord's arrangement in the caves. Looking beyond the desert dust and palace intrigues, we realize that the drama between Saul and David is not merely a record of ancient kings, but the spiritual blueprint for our own survival. The true reinterpretation of this story lies in understanding that the real danger was never the tip of the spear, but the temptation to abandon trust in the sovereign in order to fight with the hands of the ego. Spiritual survival requires us to see persecution not as an interruption of our journey, but as the ultimate proof that our loyalty belongs to the Heavenly Father and not to human systems or approvals. When you are wronged, the Creator is not silent. He is watching whether you will become a reflection of Saul's bitterness or remain anchored in David's integrity. Divine sovereignty does not fail. It merely awaits the moment when our faith is so refined that the throne, whatever it may be in our lives, is not an idol, but an instrument of service to the Most High. David's victory was not inherited by chance, but earned in the silence of one who knew how to wait for the timing of the only righteous judge. In the end, the only survival that matters is the one that keeps our peace intact before the throne of the loving Father. Studying the trajectory of men who walked under the watchful eye of the Most High requires more than curiosity. It requires a willingness for self-examination. If you seek to strengthen your spiritual musculature to withstand the pressures of the present, our next meeting will be crucial for your journey. We will dive into the resilience strategies that David developed while isolation tried to silence his hope in the caves of En-Gedi. Click the subscribe button and activate notifications to ensure that this table of solid food continues to be served to you. Your presence here confirms that the pursuit of biblical truth is your absolute priority. See you in the next study.